Welcome to Table for One. I'm the narrator, and in today's video, I'll be doing a rules refresher for Scythe. So in this video, I'm going to teach you how to play against the automated opponent, the Automa. Or in other words, I'll teach you how to play the Scythe solo mode. Let's get rolling. Alright, so I am set up to teach you how to play the solo mode of Scythe. And this is a pretty important video to me because I've had Scythe for a few years, and for most of that time it sat on my shelf mostly unplayed. I'd played it a few times multiplayer and really enjoyed it, and just had a super hard time learning the solo mode on this. But now that I finally got it down, it is really good. I enjoy it a lot. And so it's allowed me to play Scythe a lot more, and I hope I can help some people out there who maybe have Scythe and would like to play it solo and have not been able to learn it yet. So if I can get you playing more solo Scythe, all the better. And my intent is to put this video up before releasing a solo playthrough of Scythe. It's possible these will come out in the other order, but if you want to make sure you see that solo playthrough so you can see some of this stuff in action, make sure you subscribe to the channel, and why don't you leave a like while you're here so I know that you like Scythe content, and maybe I can do this again in the future for the expansions, Invaders from Afar and the Wind Gambit. But for now, we're just starting with standard Scythe. And so I'm set up to teach you this as if I am the Saxony player playing against the Rusviet player. And I did it this way for two reasons. First, I would like the opponent to be sort of on the right side of the screen because I've got this sweet new screen here where I can put some of these cards up on the left side of the screen, and you'll be able to see everything at the same time. So this technology is brought to you by my Ko-fi subscribers, so you can make a contribution to the channel on my Ko-fi page, ko-fi, link in the description. I will thank my Ko-fi contributors at the end of the video. But the other reason I've set it up this way is because I actually just recorded my solo playthrough, and I played a Saxony, and I played against Rusviet, so I still had some of the pieces out. So don't forget, there are chapter markers in this video, so if you have a specific question, you can jump to the part you want. Also, as usual, on Table for One, I'm assuming you know how to play Scythe already. If you don't know the standard rules to Scythe yet, I recommend there's a video by Watch It Played, and there's another good one by Modern Cardboard, and there's a video by Knights Around a Table as well. So any of those will get you there, and then you can come back here for the solo mode. So let's jump into it, and we'll start with the setup. So first, everything for yourself, for you as the player, is going to be set up as normal. So choose your faction, choose a player mat. Again, we're assuming I'm Saxony, so put out your starting workers and your character where they're supposed to go. You will gain all your normal starting power and starting popularity, objective cards, combat cards, all that stuff will be as usual. And then you will put out 3 random factory cards, just like any other 2-player game. So number of players plus 1, so 3 factory cards, and place a random structure bonus tile as well. And so that's all pretty straightforward. So let's talk now about what you're going to need for the Automa. First, you're going to want to pick their faction. And in general, the further away from you they are, the easier that's going to make it. So I've got Saxony. I didn't want to make it very difficult, so I picked Rusviet because they're sort of on the opposite side of the factory for me. If you're right next to each other, you're going to have a lot more combat. It'll be a more difficult game. So give the Automa the faction mat that belongs to the faction that you chose. Set up their character and their 2 starting workers the same as you would for a human player, but they are not going to get a player mat. So instead, go ahead and put all their mechs on their faction mat as well as their 6 additional workers. Place their 6 stars there. And then they will need 1 of their upgrade cubes. Outside of that, they won't need any more wooden components. So no structures, no recruits, no pawn for tracking what actions they've taken, and they won't need the other 5 upgrade cubes. Then go ahead and give them the starting power and starting combat cards according to their faction sheet. So for Rusviet, they've got 3 starting power and 2 random combat cards. Don't look at them, just put them face down in the Automa's area. And then they always start with 5 coins. So go ahead and give them 5 coins. Now, the next thing you do to set up is you need to pick a difficulty. So this comes with 4 difficulty cards here. So there are easy, normal, hard, and very hard, or as they are listed from left to right here, Automata, Automa, Automachina, and Ultimachina. So I'm going to use the Automa, the normal difficulty card here, but I will put the other ones where you can see them up here, just in case you want to compare later in the video as we start to learn what this card is doing. So you'll need one of these cards to set up. There's also this deck of Automa helper cards. So they are this grayish color on the back. These are, I mean, you can mix them up, but they're kind of in a logical order. And so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There are 8 of them with the base game, and then there are 2 additional ones if you've got invaders from afar. So this deck of helper cards, just set it nearby. It is very useful. And then there's this deck of Automa cards, or these are the, I'm going to call them the scheme cards, because there's a scheme 1 and a scheme 2. We'll talk about what that means later, but they've kind of got this bluish background here, and on their face, they are green on one half and red on the other half. So we're going to talk about what these are. But when it's time to set up, you want to keep like the 1 and the 2 facing the same way on all these cards. And that also corresponds to the green and red. And just keep them all facing the same way, shuffle them up. And then this is the deck of cards that is going to drive the Automa. So this will be what tells the Automa what to do on each of its turns. So once you've got that done, you are set up to play Scythe. So now let's talk about the flow of the games. Let's talk about this at the high level. You, as the human player, will always be the first player, and you are just going to play as normal. You're going to take your normal turns, follow all the normal rules. And after your turn, then the Automa takes a turn. You're going to alternate going back and forth, and as soon as one player has placed their 6th star, then the game ends as normal, and you're going to total up the coins, and you're going to find out who the winner is just by the normal means. So far, so good. But then the Automa is going to have a number of differences. So let me run down this quick bullet point list. I've covered some of this already. So for example, the Automa does not have recruits, structures, upgrades, or objective cards. I didn't mention objective cards. They don't have any of those either. They don't interact with that. Then they never change their popularity for any reason. So it's always at 10, no matter what. Doesn't matter what they do, how they're interacting with you or the board. Popularity never moves. It is always at 10. The Automa also does not produce resources. They'll never have any resources on any of their hexes, and they don't pay any costs to take actions. They also do not use tunnels, so they completely ignore movement through tunnels. You can still do it, just the Automa won't. They have no faction ability, so whatever the special ability of their faction is, ignore it. They also don't get any abilities for their characters or mechs as their mechs are placed out. All these upgrades here, doesn't matter what it says, you're going to completely ignore them. So as they're placing mechs, you can take any mech in any order. They're not going to use the abilities printed there on the board. As I said, they have no player mat, and then they're going to place their stars a little bit differently. We'll talk about star placement later. Combat will be a little different as well, although it's going to look very familiar. It's just the way that they retreat their units is different. Essentially, their workers go back to their home base as normal, but their character or mechs that are involved in a loss in combat go back to their faction mat. So their character can actually end up on their faction mat as well. And finally, their ability to interact with water features is a little bit different. We'll talk about how. But at the start of the game, they can't cross any water just like a human player. But when the time comes, they don't have a river walk. They can just cross any river. They kind of ignore all rivers. And they treat lakes as normal territory. So they can occupy a lake with a worker or with a character or a mech or any combination. So then I said, the game's going to go back and forth, alternating turns as normal. You'll take your turn. The Automa will take a turn. You'll go back and forth until one player places their 6th star. That ends the game. So your turns are normal. On the Automa's turn, what they're going to do is they're going to draw the top card from this Automa deck, and they're going to follow the directions on the card, and that's 3 steps. There's really 4. There's 3 lines here and this star in the middle. So we're just going to work from the top of the card to the middle of the card, ignoring the bottom half. I'll talk more about the structure of the cards in a minute, but they're going to do this part, then they'll do this part, then they'll do this part, and then they'll check this star. Then the card is discarded and it goes back to you. And really the hardest part about running this whole thing is this top line. So I'm going to save that for last. I think I'm going to teach these in reverse order. So I'll start with the stars, then line 3, line 2, and line 1. So let's look at a couple cards in a little closer detail here. So we've got, we'll put these 2 up on the screen. These 2 cards, we're only looking at the top half. This whole bottom part that's red, don't worry about it. Anything below the star, we're not going to look at right now. And all I want you to look at is this star in the middle. So this card has this, gold star and a gear. This card has a star crossed out. That is telling you at the end of the Automa's turn, you will either advance their star track, on this left option, or not advance the star track as shown on the right. So let's take a look at the star track. That will be found on your difficulty card here. So when the game starts, we've got our Automa card, and you will take your wooden cube and place it on that greenish Roman numeral 1. That is the first space on the star track, and you can see the other cards over here, they all start with a Roman numeral 1 as well. So after the Automa does all its stuff, if the card has this gold star in the middle, then you will advance this cube one space on the star track. So that just means it goes to the right, and once you get all the way to the right, you just go to the next row and you continue to advance. If, however, the Automa's card, when you get to the end of it, you've done all this other stuff here, if the star is crossed out, then you do not advance on the star track. So there's a few different features on this difficulty card with the star track on it. So let's talk about what these features are. So obviously we've got the large Roman numeral 1 and then a Roman numeral 2. At the start of the game, you've got Roman numeral 1. Let me pull this back over here so you can see. And that's what's telling us to use this green half of the Automa cards, which you can see the backside is a Roman numeral 1. So we're on scheme 1. That's what that's called. So every time we flip a card, we're just looking at the top half of the card, that green half. We're following the directions for scheme 1. Now, as the block advances, as they go down their star track, eventually they will get to this point where they cover up a Roman numeral 2. Once that Roman numeral 2 has been covered up, you're going to take the Automa's discard pile, and they may have multiple discard piles. We'll talk about how that can happen later. But you take all their cards from their deck and any discard piles, and you make a mess, and you try and keep them the same direction, shuffle them back up, and then you form a new deck just by shuffling all the cards again, but you're going to rotate this now, and now they're on scheme 2. So after they've covered that Roman numeral 2, from that point on, every time you draw an Automa card, you're using the other side now, this red side, and it's got the same format. There are still 3 lines and then the star in the middle, and you're going to execute those lines in the exact same way that you did in the first half, but now you're just in the back half of the game, and these cards tend to be a little bit more aggressive, and they give the Automa more benefits, more stuff to do on their turn. So that's the first thing we need to know about this star track and these difficulty cards. We're on scheme 1 at the start of the game, and we stay there until we cover up scheme 2. And then from then on, we're on scheme 2 after we shuffled their Automa deck. Now, the next thing you'll see is there's a lot of not filled in, like empty stars, and then there's a few filled in gold stars on this card. And specifically, there are 6 filled in gold stars. And the first of those filled in stars is always the space with the number 2 Roman numeral on it. So anytime this block enters a space with a filled in star, then you will take one of the stars from the Automa's faction mat, and let me slide this down a little. You will place it up here by the Triumph track, and it is considered to be on the Triumph track. So that is a star they have placed for any game purpose, but it doesn't go in a specific spot. So as you can see on this card, as well as on all these cards up here, no matter the difficulty, there are 6 filled in stars on the track. So when the Automa gets to its last star, it'll place its 6th star, and that will end the game. But usually they'll end it sooner than that if you don't end it first. But that is a new method for gaining stars that only applies to the Automa. Now, since we're talking about stars, let's talk about the other ways Automa can get stars besides what it says on their card here. So the other ways are, if they get their power track all the way to the top, the first time they do that, they still place 1 star in the max power area of the Triumph track there. So the power track still operates as normal in terms of gaining stars for the Automa. In addition, the Automa can win combat up to 2 times. Now, it doesn't matter what faction they're playing. So, Saxony, their faction ability is they can gain multiple stars from combat, but we ignore those abilities. So the Automa, no matter who they are, they can accomplish that up to twice. So they can place up to 2 stars from winning combat, 1 star from the power track. All the other stars will come from their Automa card, or their difficulty card here with the star track on it. So it's possible that the 3rd filled in star 1, 2, 3 could be their 6th star. So they could end the game quite a bit sooner than having to go through this entire track. So that's how stars work with Automa. And the only other thing to cover on this card is these blue wavy lines with a slash through them. What that is saying is anytime the Automa's block is on a space with that icon, then they cannot cross or interact with water in any way. They cannot cross any rivers and they cannot go on any lakes. But once they have advanced beyond that point, now they can cross all rivers and they can send units onto lakes. And that applies even to their workers. So they don't have like normal river walk. Like they don't have to have their mech pick up their workers. Just any worker can cross a river. They don't care. So that's a little bit more simplified than what it is for a human player. It's pretty easy to remember. It's not faction dependent. So you can see on Automata, on easy difficulty, then that wavy line goes to space 5. Here on Automa, it goes to space 4. On Automachina, it goes to space 3. And on Ultimachina, there is no icon. So on the very hard difficulty, they can just cross rivers and occupy lakes from the start. So yeah, I imagine that is very difficult. So once again, just to recap, here's the difficulty card with the star track on it. And at the outside of the game, you're using scheme 1, which means you're using this green side of the card with the 1 on the back, and you're just when the Automa takes a turn, you're just executing whatever instructions are on the top half through the star, and you ignore the bottom. Once they get to that number 2 space, then 2 things happen. 1, they place a star beside the triumph track, and now you shuffle any discard piles you have as well as your main pile, and now you are on scheme 2 for the rest of the game, which is the red half of these Automa cards. And from then on, again, whenever they cover up a star, you'll place another one of their stars beside the triumph track, and then the blue lines, the wavy lines with the slash through it, just means they cannot cross or interact with water features. And once that is no longer on their space, then they can cross all rivers and occupy lakes. And so once again, when it's the Automa's turn, you're going to flip one of these cards, you're going to do all the stuff it says, and as the very last step, you will check, is there a star in the middle or not? And if so, that's when you advance the star track. So I know that was a lot, but let's keep going. So let's talk about the structure of these top 3 rows and what they do. So this top row is Automa's going to move something, or it's at least going to try. Then the Automa is going to gain some stuff. Then there is a potential recruit bonus, and then you check for stars. So let's talk about this recruit bonus next. We'll just continue to go in reverse order, and let's bring up maybe some other examples as well, just so you can kind of see what those look like. Though I imagine you could figure it out if you use your imagination. So during the recruit bonus step, if there is a recruit icon there, which is just this icon right here, it'll be followed by some sort of other bonus symbol. So in this case, we've got power and then a coin and then a combat card. It could also have a popularity icon. If you have enlisted the recruit with the corresponding bonus, then you gain that bonus. So the Automa doesn't have recruits. They never interact with recruits. This is just so that you continue to use the recruit action on your own player board. So on the Automa's turn, they're going to move something, they're going to gain some stuff, and then if you've enlisted the recruit that is listed here, so the one that gives you power, then at this time you would gain 1 power, or 1 coin, or 1 combat card, or 1 popularity. So you can see popularity on the opposite side of this card. On scheme 2, there's enlist popularity, and you'll notice some cards don't have any bonus at all. And then it doesn't matter if you've enlisted any recruits or not, you don't get anything. So I think that's pretty straightforward. If it's blank, then it's blank. If it's not blank, then if you have that recruit bonus, gain it now. That's simple enough. So now let's move to step 2, this second row. This is the step where the Automa gains stuff. So whatever it says there, the Automa gains it. So in this case, the Automa would gain 3 power. So when you get to resolving that step, they're just on their power track, go up by 3. And remember, if their power track ever does get to the top, then they will get a star the first time that happens in the normal way. And if they ever can't completely fulfill what it says, like this card says gain 3 power and they can only gain 2 more, they just gain as much as possible. So no big surprise there. So they might gain power. Other things they might gain are workers and coins. So a coin is pretty straightforward. Just give them one coin. But the worker, that means take one worker off of their faction mat and place it in their home base. We'll talk about how it gets out of there later. But whenever you see the worker symbol, just place a worker from their faction mat to their home base. And if all of their workers are already out on the board somewhere, if they have no more on their faction mat, you just don't do anything. You just ignore the command. You might also see here is gain a worker as well as gain a combat card. So not super complicated. Just grab the next combat card from the pile. Don't look at it and place it by their player area. So they gain one combat card. And finally, the last symbol you might see is this one. And this is an icon that's going to come up a lot. It's a combined icon. It means character or mech. So in this instance, that means take a character or mech from their faction board and place it in their home base, just like we talked about with a worker. And whenever you see that symbol, they're always going to prefer the character over the mech. So we talked a little bit earlier that if the Automa's character is involved in combat and loses, it will not retreat to its home base. It'll come back to the faction mat. So that's how it gets there. Same thing for mechs. If mechs are in combat and they lose, they come back to the faction mat. And then this icon here is to redeploy. And so it doesn't matter character or mech, whichever one you're deploying, it still goes to the home base. And they will always prefer the character if possible. Otherwise, it's a mech. And when they deploy a mech, again, it doesn't matter which one because they're ignoring all of these upgrade abilities. So any mech will do, and they'll just place it in their home base. So we have covered stars and recruit bonuses and the Automa gaining stuff. The last thing to do is cover movement, and that is going to be the most difficult part. So that's why I saved it to the end. Let's do a quick refresher. So you draw an Automa card on the Automa's turn, and starting at the top, they're going to do some sort of movement, which we'll talk about in a minute. Then they gain stuff. So in this case, they're going to gain a worker if they can, and they'll get a combat card. Then there's the recruit bonus. If you've enlisted the recruit that gives you a combat card as a bonus, gain it now. And then there's the star track. If this is filled in, advance the track. If it's crossed out, do not advance the track. Then you just discard the card and it goes to Automa's, or it goes back to your turn. So let's talk about movement. There's going to be some icons here and some new concepts. So let's start by talking high level about what is going on in this top line. So this top line will probably have multiple icons separated by slashes. And so the way these cards work is you start all the way on the left and you try and resolve the first icon or set of icons. If you are able to resolve the icon, then you ignore everything else to the right of it and you move down to line 2 where the Automa gains stuff. If you cannot resolve the first set of icons for whatever reason, then you go to whatever's next after that slash, try and resolve that. If you can, then stop and continue on. If you cannot, then continue trying to resolve the next one to the right. And you keep going until you either resolve one set of icons or you run out of icons, in which case you just move on to the next step. Now, there are a lot of icons going on. Let's start with this card here. We're going to talk about this icon. It's like a gear with a really little star in it, and the whole gear is crossed out. So it's this icon right there. If you see that on any card, all that means is if you are playing on Autometa on the easy difficulty, then the Automa skips its entire turn. So if you see that icon and you're playing on easy, you just take the card and discard it without doing anything else, and now it goes to your turn. If you are not playing on easy difficulty, then that icon doesn't do anything and you just ignore it and continue on. So that's pretty straightforward. Next, you may notice on some cards, there are icons that are in parentheses, these parenthetical icons, and they always start with a faction. So let me give you another example here. It might look like that. And you can see on that example, there's even a parenthetical in the middle box. So in all these cases, what it's saying is you only try and resolve that icon or set of icons if the Automa is that faction. So on this top card, if the Automa is this blue Nordic faction, then do this. If they are not, like in this case, they are Russviet, then move on to the whatever's after that slash. Move on to trying to resolve that icon. Same thing here. If they are this faction, try and do that. Otherwise, move on to this. And on this card, just since we're on the example, for on the second line here, that means if the Automa is playing as Crimea, then they will gain a coin. And then no matter what faction they are, gain a coin. So for this particular row 2 on this card, Crimea gains 2 coins. All other factions gain 1 coin, because importantly, you resolve all icons in this second row. Only the first row is where you resolve the first icon that you can and then stop. So let me give you another brief detour here since we're using Rustviet. So this middle row here, Rustviet will try and take a character or mech from their faction board and move it to their home base. And then whether or not they're able to do that, all factions will then try and take a character or a mech and move it to their home base. So in this way, all factions would get their character out if possible. If their character's already out, then they'll get a mech. Rustviet would get their character out if possible and a mech, or if their character was already out at the beginning, they would get 2 mechs. So that's how any of those parentheticals work. Let's get back to the other icons on the movement part. But in order to do that, we're going to have to talk about the concept of neighborhoods. So this is the big scary part, but we're going to get through it. So the neighborhood of a unit is the territory that the unit's on, plus all the territories that they could reach by a movement of 1 territory. So let's break this down with an example using my character, and then we'll assume they're there. The neighborhood of this character is this territory that they're on, plus all territories that they can reach through a movement of 1 territory action. So this character could move to here, and it can move to here. But if we say we're at the beginning of the game and I don't have Riverwalk, this, and this would not be part of its neighborhood, and this faction can never go on lakes, so that would not be part of its neighborhood. So this character's neighborhood would be the hex that it's on, plus these 2 hexes. Now, as Saxony, if I had the Riverwalk ability activated, then I can cross rivers into woods or into mountains. So for this character with Riverwalk, then their neighborhood would be this hex they're on, plus these 2 hexes, plus this one that it could reach. So that's how to think about it for human players. But for the Automa, it's a little different, a little more simplified. So it kind of works the same way. Like the territory for we'll put their character here. The neighborhood for this character is the hex they're on plus the 2 that they could reach with a movement of 1 hex, assuming that they have not unlocked the ability to cross water. Once they can cross water, then the neighborhood of this character is just going to be its own hex plus the 6 hexes surrounding it, because they don't care about crossing rivers anymore. They treat lakes as regular territories. So at the start of the game, it's just going to be limited to this little area. But once they have unlocked the ability to interact with water, it's always each unit's neighborhood will be its own hex plus the 6 around it. So that is how a neighborhood works. Units that are on the home base have no neighborhood, but the home base itself always has a neighborhood of the 2 adjacent hexes to it where the workers would start. So that's the concept of neighborhoods. What is with all this neighborhood business? Why are we talking about it? Well, Automa does not move like a human player moves. The Automa uses teleportation. So there's a little paragraph about this in the rulebook if you want the flavor text on it. But essentially, when an Automa unit moves, they are able to move to a space that is in the neighborhood of any Automa unit. So they're just going to be jumping all over the board. They're not worrying about counting how many movement spaces. They don't have speed. You're just going to be taking units from the back, from the home base area, picking them up and putting them towards the front of wherever their territory is. So let's now go through each of their movement types. And this is where these little reminder cards that I mentioned earlier are going to come into play, because this is just each card is detailing 1 type of action. So just go in order. We will start with moving a worker. So this is the icon for move a worker. It is move worker, right? Easy enough. And for the purposes of demoing this, let's assume that Automa is far enough on their star track that they can cross water. So if the Automa is going to try and move a worker, first they need to select a worker. It's going to be the closest one to their base. In this example, they have one on their home base, so that's who they would select. If that was not the case, then they would select the closest one to their base. In this case, it's a tie, and you can see the tiebreaker on the card is reading order. That is frequently a tiebreaker here. Reading order means you're just going to start at the top left hex. Let me get this out of the way for a second. Start all the way up here, and you're just going to go to the right and then go to the next row and continue on just like as if you're reading lines of text. And the first one that you bump into, all right, that's the one you're selecting. That's the tiebreaker. So that's how reading order works. So in this case, we would be moving this worker here. Now, where can they go? What's a valid hex? And again, we're assuming they can cross water at this point. So valid hex is a hex that is in the neighborhood of any Automa unit. So I'm going to use some of these metal coins, these single, 1 coins from Scythe to start marking what could be a valid hex. So in the neighborhood of any Automa unit, what's in the neighborhood of this unit? Well, that's its own hex plus each of the adjacent hexes, assuming they can cross water. All right, now we'll check this unit. This unit's neighborhood is its own hex, which is already marked, plus all adjacent hexes. So that includes this one. This character does not contribute at all. It doesn't have a neighborhood, but the home base always includes the neighborhood of these 2 spaces here. So these are all the valid hexes so far. And then if any of these contained an enemy unit, it would no longer be valid. And it's not valid if it already contains an Automa worker other than the one selected. So remember, this is the one we selected. This is the one that is moving. It could move to its own space. It could not move to this space because there's a worker. So this is not valid. So now that we've figured out what the valid hexes are, the next step is pick up the selected worker. So now it is no longer on the map. Now where's it going to go? It's going to go to a valid hex. So one of the ones that we've already marked. And then it wants to choose the one that's this is just a bullet point list where there's a priority list. You're going to start at the top. So it needs to be in the neighborhood of the most Automa units. So these 3 spaces are each in the neighborhood of 1 Automa unit. These 3 spaces are in the neighborhood of no Automa units. So we've got a 3-way tie so far. It'll want one of those spaces, and it cannot be in the neighborhood of any enemy combat units. So that would be my combat units. So if, for example, a combat unit is just going to be a character or a mech. So let's say that I had my character here. This is in the neighborhood of my unit. Well, that's not really true because that's a lake and I can't get there. But I think you understand the principle. Don't worry about it too much. If it was in the neighborhood of any of my combat units, it would no longer be valid. So in this case, we still have 3 valid hexes. So how are we going to break this tie? Well, it's going to choose whatever's closest to the factory. So the Automa is always trying to get to the factory. So from here, this is 1, 2. This is 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So this would win the tiebreaker. If there was still a tie, then the next tiebreaker would just be reading order. So this one meets all the criteria and is closer to the factory than all the others. So that is where we are going to take this worker and place them. So that's how they've moved their worker. Now, importantly, if they pick up their worker and then place it back down in the same hex where it came from, that still counts as a valid action, and you would not resolve any other movement actions for the Automa. You would move on to the Automa gains stuff step. So that's how moving a worker works. Let me just throw a few more pieces out there, just as an example, and then I can put my character here. Okay, let's resolve this again. So start at the top. We're going to choose a worker that's closest to their base. That's going to be one of these 2. And then it's a tie, so the tiebreaker will be reading order. So we're going to select this one here, and we're going to move them into the neighborhood of any Automa unit. So let's start marking spaces that are in the neighborhood of any Automa unit. This one, this one, this one here, these over here. And then at this point, if either of the spaces that are in the neighborhood of the Automa's base were not valid, we would mark them as valid as well. And then none of these can contain an enemy unit. So that means not my character, not my mech, and not my workers. So far we're clear. And then no Automa worker other than the one we're starting with. So again, we're starting with this one. So we'll mark as invalid any of the spaces that already have a worker. So what this is telling you is they can only have 1 worker per space. They'll never have more than 1 worker in a hex. Then we're going to pick up the selected worker, and we're going to place them in a valid hex, so one of the ones that's marked, that's in the neighborhood of the most Automa units and not in the neighborhood of enemy combat units. So here I've got an enemy combat unit. Its neighborhood includes the factory, so that space is no longer valid, but it cannot move into the lake, so that is still a valid option. So let's see, how many Automa units are in the neighborhood of each of these spaces? So 0, 0, this one is in the neighborhood of 2 units. This one's in the neighborhood of 2 units. This one's 1. So right now, 2 is the number to beat. 0, 0, 1. This one is in the neighborhood of 2. This one's in the neighborhood of 1. This one's in the neighborhood of 1. This one's in the neighborhood of 3. All right, we can't beat 3. That is the highest number. If it was a tie, then we would next select by reading or by which is closest to the factory. And then if it was still a tie, reading order. So now that we are down to just one location, then you place the selected worker there. And that is it for that movement action. So that is how workers move. Let's move on to the next type. So that is a non-attacking mech move. So in order to do this, there's got to be a mech somewhere out on the map. It could be in the home base. Let's say our map looks like this though. So the Automa wants to move a mech and they are not attacking. So first we need to select a mech. They're going to take the one closest to the base. And if that's a tie, normal reading order is how they select. So same way they select a worker. So in this case, that's going to be this one here is closest to the base. Now this mech will move to any space, any hex that is in the neighborhood of any Automa unit or in the neighborhood of the base. So here's the neighborhood of the base. Let's get the neighborhood of all the units. So for this mech, this is its own neighborhood. For this mech here, its own neighborhood includes its own hex plus all of those around it. Again, assuming it can interact with water, which looks like it can at this point. This unit's neighborhood will include those. This unit has a neighborhood that includes these. This unit's neighborhood is here. Okay. So that's a lot of territory it can jump around and teleport to with this mech, right? So now the next thing is it cannot contain an enemy unit because it's a non-attacking move. That is not an issue right now. And then it has no Automa combat unit other than the one selected. So again, combat units are going to be mechs and characters. So this mech is moving, so this is a valid space, but it will not go here. So just as a Automa will never put a worker in the same space as another Automa worker, they'll only have one worker per space. They will never have more than one mech in a space, and they will never have a mech and a character in the same space. So now that we've figured out our valid hexes, we're going to pick up the mech that is moving, and we're going to choose a valid hex that is the shortest distance from an enemy combat unit. So I've got a combat unit here. If there are combat units here, I guess you can't see. If there are combat units, if I have combat units on my home base, the Automa is going to ignore them unless those are the only combat units I have. So as long as I have at least one on the map somewhere, that's the one that it's going to be targeting. So in this case, I do have a character out. So they want to be the shortest distance from an enemy combat unit. So shortest distance from here. Well, this is a distance of 1 and this is a distance of 1. So everything else is going to be greater than 1. So I know this looks like a lot going on right now as I'm marking these, but this is just a helpful visual tool. Once you start playing, I promise this becomes much, much quicker to figure out. So it doesn't take nearly the time that it's taking me right now to demo it. And you'll see that in my solo playthrough. But okay, these are both a distance of 1 from an enemy combat unit. And then tiebreaker is going to be closest to the factory. Well, this one is the factory, so you can't get any closer than that. So that is where the mech is going to be placed. So you can see in this example, this mech just teleported from here to here. That's a move that you would not normally be able to make as a human player. So the Automa is definitely moving differently from humans. But the important takeaways so far are only one worker per hex and only one mech and or character per hex. But a mech and a worker can be on the same hex, or a character and a worker can be on the same hex, just not multiple workers, not multiple combat units. So this will start to get a little quicker now as we're getting the system down. The next icon you might see is this one. This is just a non-attacking move for the character. So this is going to work exactly the same as how it moved its mech. It's going to find its character wherever it is and move it so long as it's not on its faction mat. If it's on the faction mat, it can't move its character at all. It would have to gain its character back first. But as long as it's on the board, it's going to try and move its character. The valid hexes are in the neighborhood of any Automa unit or in the neighborhood of its base, with no enemy units because it's not attacking, and with no Automa mechs because the character will not share a hex with its own mech. Then you pick up the character, choose a destination hex, any of the valid hexes, shortest distance from the enemy from an enemy combat unit, again ignoring the ones in the home base unless that's the only choice, then closest to the factory, and then reading order as the tiebreaker. Now the only important difference is at the bottom. If there's an encounter token there, then the enemy is going to pick up the encounter token. The Automa is going to pick up the counter token. And if that hex that they chose happens to be the factory and they do not have a factory card yet, they gain a factory card. I'm going to talk about that more on the next action, which is encounter/factory. So this means that the Automa's character is specifically trying to go to the factory or gain an encounter token. So, I think that's kind of obvious from the icon there of the factory and an encounter token. So once you figured out your valid hexes, you pick up the character, move them to a valid hex with no enemy unit because it's a non-combat type movement. So if I had my character here in the factory, they would not go there. And then with no Automa mechs, because they won't share a hex with their own mechs and their characters. Tiebreaker is closest to the factory, and then reading order after that. If the Automa character goes to the factory and they don't have a factory card yet, it's very simple. They just take one random factory card, don't reveal it, they get it. Now they have a factory card. They're not going to interact with it in any way, but that just marks that they've been to the factory with their character. And if another card like this one shows up again, then they won't try and go back to the factory. At that point, they'll start going after encounter tokens. Now, if the Automa instead ends up on a hex with an encounter token, it's very simple. They just gain the token and do nothing else. They don't interact with the encounter cards at all. All they're doing is denying you the ability to get that token. They won't score any points for it. Nothing else will happen. They've just taken the token off the map. So that is how the Automa character interacts with the factory and with encounter tokens. And we've only got 2 of these movements left, so we're getting towards the end. First is going to be an attack move versus a worker. So this means they are trying to take over a hex where you have a worker and only workers. So it's an attack move, but there won't be a combat. So let's go down the list here. They're going to select one of their own combat units, whichever one is closest to their base. So remember, a combat unit can be a mech or their character. So just going to select whichever one of those is closest to their base. And then the tiebreaker is reading order. And then they're going to look for valid hexes. So hexes that are in the neighborhood of any Automa unit or in the neighborhood of their own base that contain an enemy worker. That means your worker. And no enemy combat units. So workers that are by themselves, that don't have a mech or character there to protect them. Then they're going to pick up their combat unit. They're going to move it to a valid hex, and if there are multiple targets, they're going to take the one that has the most resources. So wherever you've got the most resources stockpiled, that's where they're attacking. That is their preference. But as the card says, they can attack where there are 0 resources as well, if that's the best they can do. If they have multiple options, again, the first tiebreaker will be whichever is closest to the factory. Tiebreaker 2 is going to be reading order. Then they're going to place their combat unit on the destination hex. All of your workers on that hex are going to retreat back to your home base as normal, but they will not lose any popularity because, again, their popularity is always at 10. It never moves for any reason. So you're just going to have to retreat all your workers, and you're going to remove all resources from the hex. So any resources that were there are just removed because the Automa never has resources on its hexes. So you just take them out and put them back in the supply. They're gone. They robbed you. So again, just notice that is right there, the attack icon and the worker icon. So they are doing an attack move against your workers. And again, they don't prefer their character or their mech. It's just whoever is closest to their home base is going to go out and grab whichever one of your hexes has unprotected workers with the most resources possible. So with that said, there's only one more movement action left, and that is an attack move versus a combat unit. So you're going to have this combat icon there, this attack icon, and then a number. There's an X on this card, and then the character and mech icon. So that means they are going to move against your characters and or mechs, they're going to move against your combat units, and there's an X. So what does that X mean? The X means that there's a condition. Their power must be at least whatever number that X is. So let's take a look at a couple examples here. So we're on the Scheme 2 side. So this top card is saying they will attack as long as they have at least 5 power on the power track. The card under it is saying that Automa will take an attack action as long as they have at least 7 power on the power track. If they don't meet that criteria, then you just continue moving to the right. So this top card, if they don't meet that criteria, they don't have at least 5 power, then they will try and take an an attack action against one of your workers. And if that is not something they can execute for any reason, then they will take a non-attack movement with one of their mechs. The second card, if they have at least 7 power, they'll take an attack action against one of your combat units. If they do not have enough or they can't perform that action, then they'll try and do an attack action against your workers. And again, if they can't do that for some reason, then they'll take a non-attacking movement with their mechs. So let's assume they have enough power. Then they're going to select a combat unit. They're going to take the one closest to their base. Tiebreaker is reading order. So we've seen that many times now. That's how they're selecting which of their units is going to be doing the attacking. Then valid hexes. So in the neighborhood of any Automa unit or in the neighborhood of their own base. And the hex has to contain an enemy combat unit. So meeting the criteria of all the neighborhood stuff, it needs to be a hex that has your character or mech. Then you're going to pick up their combat unit and you're going to decide where to set it down. That is going to be a valid hex, as we've already determined, with the fewest enemy combat units. So they don't want to get ganged up on. If they've got the option and one of your hexes has 2 mechs in it and one has just your character, they'll go after your character, right? Then if there are multiple options, tiebreaker is closest to the factory, tiebreaker 2 is reading order. So then they're going to place their unit in the destination hex and you're going to resolve combat. Now it's time to talk about combat, but that is all the different types of movement actions. So we can take a look at some of these real quick, just check your understanding. In this case, they're just going to move a worker. In this case, they're going to try and go to the factory or resolve an encounter with their character. And if they can't do that, then they will do a non-combat move with their character. In this instance, only if they are Polonia, then they will try and go to the factory or resolve an encounter with their character. Otherwise, if they can't do that as Polonia, or if they're any other faction, then they will do a non-combat move with a mech. And if they can't complete that, then they will try and do a move with one of their workers. And either they accomplish that, or if they can't do it, doesn't matter. At that point, you just move on to the next line. They gain a worker, they gain either a character or a mech, and then you check for this enlist bonus. If you have the popularity enlist bonus, you gain it, and then you advance one on the star track. So that is how their turns progress. So, okay, now let's talk about how combat works. So when you are playing against the Automa, combat for you, for the human player, is going to work the same way. So at the start of combat, you are going to choose your combat power and your combat cards. So as normal, you'll look down here at your power track. You can use a maximum of 7 power. And so you'll go to your wheel here and you'll set your power to whatever level you want it at. And then for every combat unit in the combat, so for every character and or mech you have in the combat, you may play up to 1 combat card. So you're going to set those aside and decide whatever it is you're going to play. And once you've got that locked in, then you are going to figure out what the Automa is going to do. And for the sake of demonstration, let's pretend this card is right here in the discard pile. So once you've got all your stuff figured out, you're going to draw the next card from the Automa deck, but you are going to be looking at this part on the side that we haven't touched yet. So it actually goes sideways, and let me just bring this down to the top of the screen and we can talk about what's going on here. So let's start from left to right. There's always going to be this section here where there is a range, and the range is always going to be from 0 to 7, from 8 to 13, and from 14 and up. That is telling you find where in that range the Automa's power token is here on the power track. So in this instance, they would be in the 0 to 7 range, but they could also be from 8 to 13 or 14 plus. Then the number under the range is telling you how much power they will spend. So again, in this example, they have 0 to 7 power. It says spend 2. So they would take their dial and set it to 2, and then they would move down 2 spaces on the power track. Now, if, for example, if when combat started, they only had 1 power, and the range 0 to 7, it says use 2, they're just going to use as much as possible. So in that case, they would only use 1 power. But then there's going to be 2. So after you've figured out where in that range they are and how much power to use, Then you're going to look here, and there is going to be between 0 and 3 combat cards. So it doesn't matter what is participating in the combat, because Automa will never have more than one combat unit on a hex at any given time. So they're not sending more than one mech or their mech and their character at the same time. They're only sending one combat unit. So regardless of the number of combat units they have, they're going to spend that many combat cards, or as many as they can if it lists more cards than they have. So in the example we have on screen, there's a 1 combat card icon. So you would take the Automa's combat cards, and they should be mixed anyway. You don't know what they are, but you can shuffle them if you like. And then you add one to the combat, and you can flip it over, and that is their combat strength. So in this case, it would be 5. But just to show you some other examples, here are some other cards where they're spending 0 or 2 combat cards, and you can see the ranges are the same, but the amount of power they spend is variable. And let me grab a couple other examples. So if I just throw a few different ones on the screen here. This top one, you can see there's 3 combat cards, and this bottom one, you can see they're using 0 power no matter how much they have on their power track here. So even if they have 14 plus, they'll use 0. So like a human opponent, they can sort of trick you into spending more power than you need to. So you should be aware of that. But after determining how much combat strength the Automa has, you will then resolve combat as normal, meaning you'll just compare their total strength to your total strength, and whoever has the higher number wins, and in the event of a tie, the tie goes to the attacker. And then just like in a normal game, whoever loses the combat, as long as they committed at least 1 power, either in the form of a power card or by using any power on their dial here, they will gain 1 combat card. So that applies to both you and the Automa for whoever loses the combat. Now, as a reminder, I've said this already, but if the Automa loses, retreat its combat unit back to its faction mat, including if it's its character. So character or mech, regardless, it comes back to its faction mat. If it had any workers, then they go back to its home base. Whereas if the Automa wins, any of your units that were there all retreat to your home base, and if there are any resources there, they are removed. Then, in the event that you were attacking a hex that was controlled by the Automa and you win the combat, so whether there are workers there or a combat unit or both, if you attack one of their hexes and you win, you need to determine how many resources were on that hex, because you can gain resources that way. So normally they don't mess with resources at all, but if I send my character into here, for example, this mountain, and I send their worker back to here, well, there's going to be some metal there that I can gain. And so the amount is going to be determined by the top card of the main discard pile. There's this little box here. There's 3 resources in it. That means I'm going to gain 3 metal if I attack that hex. So let me just bring that up on the screen. So you can see here, there are 3 resources. This card had 4. And so the point is, this is always the top card of the discard pile. So if it is your turn before you attack, you know how many resources you can potentially gain from any given space before you attack it. Just like in a real game, you don't have to, it's not determined by the combat card itself. It's not a random amount of resources that you're getting. It's not unknown. You do have the information before you decide to attack. So I think that's clever. That's really cool. Now, that only applies to standard resources. So if you attack a mountain or a tundra or a farm or the woods, you'll get wood or food or oil or metal respectively. If you take over an Automa hex that is a village or a lake or the factory, then you don't gain any resources. And again, that's known information going in. So I think that's a pretty good system. It replicates combat with human players pretty well. And then importantly, the card you use to resolve the combat goes in its own separate discard pile. So that way, if there's going to be more combat, then this is still the top card of the main discard pile to determine how many resources are available. So if you need to resolve multiple combats on the same turn, then for each combat, you will set your power, determine if you're going to use any combat cards, draw the next Automa card, and be surprised by whatever it says at the bottom. Use that to determine the combat strength for Automa, but the rewards are still dictated by the main discard pile. And so that is why I said some time ago, when you get to here and you move from Scheme 1 to Scheme 2, you need to take your main deck, if there's anything left, as well as your main discard pile and any other discard piles. So if you have a combat discard pile, take them all and shuffle them together and make your new deck that way. Now, when that happens, and I should also say, if you ever just run out of the main deck and you need more cards, same thing, you're going to shuffle all your decks together. When you do that, before you shuffle everything, make sure you remember what was the top card of the discard pile, the main discard pile, so that after you've shuffled it, if you happen to attack, you know how many resources you should be gaining. So before you shuffle that card back into the deck, keep track of how many resource icons were on it so that you can continue the flow of the game. So I think the only thing we have left to talk about now is scoring in the end game. So as I mentioned, the game ends when any player places their 6th star, and that ends the game immediately. And scoring proceeds as normal with the couple following notes. You're going to score everything as normal, with the only small exception, when you score your resources, you can only score a maximum of 6 resources per hex. So if you've got just a giant stockpile of 10 resources on one hex, 6 is going to be the max per hex. Now, that being said, you can have more than 6 resources scattered all over the place, and you could have 6 and 6 and 6 and 6, but 6 is the max per hex. Otherwise, you're going to score everything completely as normal. Now, the Automa is going to score everything essentially the same as normal. Their popularity is always at 10, so they're always in tier 2. So the Automa will always get 4 coins for every star they've placed. That includes any that they've placed from this star track. They're sort of next to the Triumph track. They count as being on the track, so they get full points for any star they've placed. Every hex that they have, they gain 3 coins, and then they never have resources, so they don't score any coins for resources. They also never build structures, so they don't score anything for the structures bonus tile, but you still do. And then the winner is determined by whoever has the most coins at that point, as usual. The only other thing to note is in the event of a tie. So if you have the same number of coins, there are a number of tiebreakers in the book, and you're going to skip the one that says number of resource tokens controlled, because again, the Automa never has any resources, so that's just not a criteria. You skip that one. So I'll run through these real quick in case you need a reminder. But the first tiebreaker is number of workers, mechs, and structures that you have. And this is unchanged, so even though the Automa can't build structures, you still count yours. Then the second criteria is who has the most power. The third tiebreaker is who has the most popularity, and again, they're always at 10. The fourth tiebreaker is normally number of resource tokens controlled, but you would skip that one and move on to tiebreaker 5, number of territories controlled, and if it is still tied at that point, it is number of star tokens placed on the board, which essentially means whoever placed their 6th star and ended the game, that is the winner. So that is it. Those are the solo rules for playing Scythe against the Automa. And so if I haven't done so already, I will put up a solo playthrough in a couple days of me playing as Saxony against the Automa playing as Rusviet, and I play on the normal difficulty on the Automa difficulty level. And so subscribe to the channel if you don't want to miss that or other Scythe content. And if you want more Scythe, let me know by first leaving a like here and then talking to me down in the comments. I know this can be tricky. It helps to see it on a playthrough, so be sure to check that out. But if you have questions, do let me know. I'd be happy to help you out. And then let me go ahead and thank all of my Ko-fi contributors, and you can feel free to join them by going to my Ko-fi page. There's a link in the description, but the reserved seating is for all of my monthly contributors, whereas the Head of the Table Award is my top 10 contributors over the last 90 days. So extra special thank you to all of these folks for making videos like this one happen. You'll notice I have no mid-roll ads in my videos, and that is thanks to my Ko-fi contributors. So know that I thank you, but so do a lot of viewers. So I hope this was helpful. I'm looking forward to playing some more Scythe. I hope this allows you to play some solo Scythe, and I will see you next time right here on Table for One. Thanks for watching.